Good afternoon. Well, I guess, yeah, maybe if it's okay, I will speak without the mask. Good afternoon. So, well, yeah, Umut already introduced me. My name is Cauwenberghe. I'm here, a doctoral researcher at the conservatory here in Antwerp. My research project is called Anthony Braxton's Tricentric Thought Unit Construct in Post-War Western Art Music. And it departs from the premise that the perception of the canon of post-war Western art music today is still strongly determined by a constructed dichotomy that keeps Western art music separate from evolutions and radical experiments in jazz and Black American music. So in my research project, I depart from Anthony Braxton's extensive oeuvre and see how I, as an interpreter, can come to a deeper understanding of Braxton's music, and in doing so can contribute to changing this perception of this historical canon. And so I adopted a method for this that I call perform the actor. And before I go into the details of this, I mean, it is I have to clarify, it is a practice-based research. Before I go into the details of this, how I approach it, it is largely informed by recent writings of several theorists and scholars, and I will just go over some of them. They also clearly demonstrate the premise that I just described of this constructed dichotomy. So let's start with Graham Locke, who is mostly known as a jazz journalist, and particularly for his book on Anthony Braxton from the 80s called Forces in Motion, which is really a sort of journalistic document text, or which reads like a biography of Anthony Braxton. He spent many hours interviewing him during a tour in the 1980s in the UK with his quartet. But this book, which appeared in the late 90s, is an academic study, really, and it's a much overlooked study questioning historical narratives as well as racial stereotyping and misrepresentations in the work of Sun Ra, Duke Ellington, as well as Anthony Braxton. The book begins with, opens with an interesting quote that I want to bring up by pianist Cecil Taylor, known as one of the great free jazz pianists of his generation, although he himself really considered himself a poet first and foremost. And the book starts, so the quote goes as follows: "But then you start to read and you discover how people put history wrong. For me, this meant a very important process of learning. It tells you that there is something else, another reality, the immaterial. This opens up certain things and might lead to the fact that the breadth of your poetic visions becomes more beautiful." And Locke adds a footnote to this and says, "At first glance, the word breadth seems to be a misprint for breath with a D. However, Taylor's use of breadth elsewhere suggests that it may be correct." And while I was rereading this text somewhere in June last year or late May, I was quickly convinced of the fact that this is indeed not a misprint when I saw tags like this circulating on social media in the wake of George Floyd's death by a police officer. It is indeed, breadth is indeed not a metaphor. This is also something that scholar Fred Moten writes about in his book In the Break, The Aesthetics of the Black Radical Tradition. He spends quite a few pages on a specific album of Cecil Taylor called Chinampas, a much lesser known album because it consists entirely of his poetry, of him performing his poetry. It's a spoken word album. He doesn't play piano at all. And so it does put to the fore the quite literal breadth of Taylor's poetic visions. In his book, Fred Moten makes the following statement also: "The idea of a black avant-garde exists as it were oxymoronically, as if black on the one hand and avant-garde on the other hand each depends for its coherence on the exclusion of the other. Now this is probably an overstatement of the case, yet is all but justified by a vast interdisciplinary text representative of a deeper, perhaps unconscious formulation of the avant-garde as necessarily not black." Scholar and composer George Lewis uses this exact quote of Fred Moten not once but twice in his very important book, A Power Stronger Than Itself, the AACM and American Experimental Music from 2009. About his book, he writes, "Part of my task in this book, as I see it, is to bring to the surface the strategies that have been developed to discursively disconnect African-American artists from any notion of experimentalism or the avant-garde." The book is an extremely detailed and important account of the development and historical significance of the AACM, which stands for Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, a collective of African-American musicians that was founded in the 60s in Chicago, which was also, of which Lewis is a member, but also Anthony Braxton is one of the early members, and many others like the Art Ensemble of Chicago, Roscoe Mitchell, Muhal Richard Abrams, and so forth. But more than just talking about the AACM as an organization, the book also gives an incredibly interesting and very different perspective on the accepted history of music of the past 60 years. Georgina Bourne, anthropologist, wrote the book Rationalizing Culture, IRCAM Boulez and the Institutionalization of the Musical Avant-Garde in the 90s. It's a detailed anthropological study of a high art institution of Western culture. So in this case, IRCAM. IRCAM is still today known as one of the most renowned centers for computer music research based in Paris and founded in the late 70s by composer Pierre Boulez. Bourne spent about a year in 1984 at IRCAM interviewing people working on all levels and echelons of the hierarchy of the organization, and gives a very interesting description of IRCAM as a powerful inheritor and defender of the dominant modernist discourse in Western art music. She also describes how Pierre Boulez, as a composer, was almost single-handedly responsible for a formation of the post-war canon of Western art music in Europe. While she was at IRCAM, Bourne encountered none other than George Lewis, who was there in 1984 as the only resident of color at IRCAM, who was researching small systems. As opposed to in the early 80s, computer music was done mostly using large, or at least the prestigious projects at IRCAM were using large computer systems, for example, to develop the electronics of Pierre Boulez's piece Répond. Lewis's project on small systems at IRCAM was much more at the margins of the institutions, although he was working at quite visionary projects using improvising computers, machine learning, artificial intelligence already in 1984, but back then was not really taken seriously. Benjamin Piekut, a scholar, American scholar, wrote a book called Experimentalism Otherwise from 2011, where he dissects 4 specific historical events taking place in New York in 1964. He applies Bruno Latour's actor network theory, and more specifically the directive follow the actor as one of his main methods to analyze these historical events, and in doing so, showing the cracks in the historical narratives on post-war Western art music that are still dominant today. He writes that in 1964, color was not an avoidable issue for the black avant-garde, and the color line marked a sharp edge for experimentalism. The questions that arise indicate that thinking about experimentalism otherwise requires not only new critical approaches, but an awareness of the areas beyond the limits of accepted experimental music history. Now, coming back to my research project, all of these texts informed, sort of, for me, create a theoretical framework for me to perform or to act, to approach Braxton's music. And I'm particularly interested in my method by Piekut's use of this, of Bruno Latour's directive, follow the actor. For him, for Piekut, follow the actor means one must abandon the limit of limit, which is different from pushing boundaries or taking it to the limit. Abandoning the limit of limit means disregarding any artificial and normative separations among fields and actors and embracing the messy assemblages that result. So, but this is primarily a theoretical method, and I, for my research, want to turn it into a practical one. Perform the actor. And so abandoning the limit of limits, for me, it means that it means disregarding any normative separations among fields and actors. In the case of Anthony Braxton, for me, it means I approach his repertoire entirely on its own terms. In doing so, I hope to come to a deeper understanding of his vast body of work and contribute to broadening the canon through performing his work. Performing the actor as a practical method does start with reading. I already mentioned Forces in Motion by Graham Locke, the biography he wrote in the 80s. It gives incredibly detailed background information on Braxton's personal life, but also his musical theory, philosophy, and his music, his compositions up until 1985. Another important work that I came across that initially triggered my interest in Braxton as a composer was reading his Introduction to My Catalogue of Work, which is a short text he wrote in 1988, about 3 pages long, and in which he really establishes his intentions as a composer, and his holistic vision on his entire body of work, where all of his compositions are connected. This text also gives very clear instructions to other people, for other people to perform this music. I also want to briefly mention the Triaxiom writings, which are 3 volumes of over 1,000 pages of philosophical essays by Braxton, which up until today have never really been edited properly. Some editions circulate, but in fairly poor condition. If there's anyone scholar, musicologist looking for an interesting subject, I would say jump on these Triaxiom writings. And then lastly, Sound American, the Sound American Braxton issue. Sound American is an online magazine edited by Nate Woolley, American trumpet player and improviser, and he dedicated an entire issue on Braxton in 2016. The reason I mention this one is that it gives extensive information on later works, starting with Ghost Trance music. Everything from the 90s up until today, Braxton kept composing incredible works. They are much less documented than, let's say, the works until the 80s. So this gives the necessary background information to start working, but then you also need, of course, scores. And now usually if you, as a performer, especially for me coming from classical music, working with composers, you get your scores through the typical channels of editors, or they are usually made available by the composer themselves or through editors. But so for Braxton's music, his scores have never really been properly edited throughout his career, or he could never really count on traditional editing companies to take care of this. And so in the 90s, he created his own tricentric foundation using a MacArthur Genius grant money that he received. The foundation went through quite some rough times over the years, but since 2010 it's been fairly stable, and they now have a small selection of scores available to purchase on their website. But the vast majority of Braxton's scores are still unedited, handwritten manuscripts tucked away in his archive in New Haven. A small number of scores also circulate sort of semi-officially, for example, through the drummer Gary Hemingway, longtime collaborator of Braxton. On his website has a couple of these scores available as well. So this already takes a bit of research to get access to the scores, but then the scores themselves only give, let's say, half the information to really get started. There is also a big amount of oral practice linked to performing Braxton's music. There's an oral tradition also that he communicated while performing himself with his musicians, with his groups. And so Tricentric Foundation also gives coachings to communicate or to explain this oral practice. But I found it very helpful also to get in touch with other collaborators with first-hand experience, such as bassist Carl Testa, saxophone player James Fay, or Nate Woolley, as I mentioned before also, and composer Catherine Young. And then, of course, there is Braxton himself as a composer of his works, but he, at age 75, keeps his distance. He retired in 2015 and he stopped giving lessons or workshops, and he keeps Tricentric Foundation for him is a kind of a front to deal with the scores and the communication dissemination of his work. There were a few occasions where I could have met him last year, but Corona made things much more complicated. About this oral practice in performing Braxton's work, it is much about communication while performing, using cues. The way his music works is that, I will briefly talk about it later also, is that it doesn't have a clear beginning or end. Often a lot happens through communication between the musicians, and there are a lot of systems that are not really written in the scores, but that you sort of learn by performing it with people who know how it works. And then to finish, there's also a large online documentation of articles, recordings, YouTube or Vimeo videos, interviews circulating online. The Tricentric website has a resources page where a lot of this is collected. And then, of course, there's the new Braxton House record label with over hundreds of hours of recordings. This is an example of one of Braxton's scores from his composition number 358 from Ghost Trance Music. Beautifully, this is one of the edited scores by the Foundation, a beautifully colored graphic score. So having the scores, having the sort of all the necessary information, so to speak, to start playing, there is still there are still more levels to unravel. If performing the actor really means going through all the following exactly the intentions of the composer and where he wants to go with his music, it is very important to also try to get an understanding of these extra layers of the music that are not really in the oral practice or in the scores or in the writings. And a lot of this is, we could spend an entire lecture on the ritual aspect of Braxton's music and the spiritual meaning of his work. And I was recently reading an article by composer Eric Webbles in which he argues that one of the reasons that Braxton's very extensive body of work still doesn't receive the recognition that it deserves in the Western art music, so to speak, is not only because of structural racism, ignorance, and so forth, but also a strong condescension towards any art that partakes sincerely of mysticism and spirituality. I think it's a very important point because it is so clear also, for example, in Georgina Bourne's book on Irkam, this very dominant modernist discourse in Western art music really strongly built on science, on a scientific discourse. So here performing the actor also means, and I can also honestly say that my own upbringing as a performer is largely informed by this discourse. And for me, it also meant opening up towards Braxton's meaning of use of spiritual aspects in his music and the ritual aspects of his work. Again, there's a lot to be said about this, but I will focus now mostly on Braxton's use of notation and time. So notation in Braxton's composition has a ritual consideration in the sense that it's always a link between past, present, and future. It is a stable factor, as in many, let's say, traditional Western music, notation that is used to perform or as a text that is to be performed exactly as it was written, and in a sense, a bridge between past and present. But notation in Braxton's music is always also a generating factor for new material, which he links to future, something that is not known yet. This is something that gives, for him, a way to give agency to the performer to speak, to give his own interpretation or his ideas on with the material that Braxton provides. And then linked to this is the non-linear use of time, and this is linked to his holistic vision, where his in his body of work, all of his compositions are connected in the same time space. His compositions or his scores are really event spaces to make these connections possible. So he himself, when talking about, for example, ghost trance music, will describe it as, rather than have a composition that goes from Mary had a little lamp and then it's finished, it's like Mary had and then there's a lot of different things she could have had. Central to all of this is the notion of improvisation. Improvisation is not completely free. It is structured via a system he devised already in the 60s called language music, a system of 12 sound parameters. Also here the number 12 has a spiritual meaning in his philosophy, in his thinking, in his work. But you can also look at the number 12 as a link, as a reference to serial music, to 12-tone music, to the European modernist music of Schoenberg, to Boulez and the serialists. So as a kind of post-serial framework to improvise with. You can also look at it as an alternative to improvising over chord changes, which is then of course linked to bebop and the jazz tradition. So Braxton's music is an example of a repertoire that is both embedded in the jazz tradition as in Western art music. And as such, it falls outside the dominant paradigms of post-war Western art music. And for me, perform the actor as a method then allows me to be unbound by these normative separations among fields or genres, to challenge these dominant notions in recent music history, its canon and its performance practice, and also approach Braxton's repertoire entirely on its own terms. But doing so doesn't mean that performing the actor, for me as a performer, has any effective result. If I play it at home, it doesn't really mean anything. You have to be able to put it on the agenda of concert halls or music schools, or it has to be seen or heard, otherwise it doesn't really mean anything. And so it was interesting also to see that, well, obviously, a large part of our music scene, let's say here in Belgium, but by extension Europe and the Western world, is still very much conditioned by this dichotomy of jazz, improvised, and classical music. And so it wouldn't be uncommon to receive somewhat uncomfortable reactions when I would approach concert programmers with my project on performing Braxton's compositions, when comments like, well, is it jazz or not jazz? Where does it fit? Oh, we have a jazz festival. I'll forward it to the jazz programmer. And so, as Piekut writes, perform or follow the actor, performing the actor, it really requires to embrace the messy assemblages that results. And so this doesn't happen from one day to the next, but it takes a little bit of time. And in a way, this embracing the messy assemblages is really a bypass of the gatekeeping and border policing functions of genre. And here I wanted to mention a recent article by George Lewis, a Small Act of Curation, which was published last year, where he states that one might ask a race-aware curation to address more poignant discussions of the gatekeeping, border policing, and kinship enforcing functions of genre, often enough based not so much on the content of the music as on its assumed provenance in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, or national origin. Here, assumed genre actually affects what we are able to hear. So for me, the question of curation here, I see it quite large. It's not just concert programmers curating their festivals. For me, it is also myself as a performer. How do I curate my program, the repertoire I want to play? How do writers decide which music to review? How do they review it? This is all a matter of curation also, in the education also. Which material do you teach to your students, and so forth. And I was, my research is still in a beginning phase, so to speak, but I had the chance to put out a record last year on the Old Dead Dust label, a small independent label in London, with some solo renditions of Anthony Braxton's Ghost Trance solos. And I was very happy to see that the label, which is until now has mostly contemporary classical composers, always portraits of one composer on their roster, and I was quite happy to see Anthony Braxton's name in between those names of Karlheinz Stockhausen, Morton Feldman, and so on. And one can then ask the question, where is the messy assemblage? It doesn't really look that messy at all. It just fits right in. And here I want to conclude again with George Lewis's own conclusion in his small act of curation, or his text, which is for me kind of a guideline as to where I want to go with my research. And Lewis says, subjecthood and membership are reflected not only in numerical representation, but also in a circulation of sounds, culture, histories, and ideas. Conceptual migration or even conceptual nomadism would create a new curatorial subject for contemporary music that can directly conceive of ascribing kinship, membership, and subjecthood to these new composers and their forebears, creating a new, creolized, usable past for new music. Thank you very much.